Working with couples has been part of my clinical practice for more than 15 years. You might think in all that time I've never met a man who wanted to be there, that every man who shows up at my office is there against his will. Surprisingly, even to me, that's not true. In my practice, men initiate couples therapy about half the time, and I've noticed those men have better outcomes than men who are dragged in by their wives. That's anecdotal, but I think it makes sense that a man generates good luck for himself when he takes the initiative in solving problems. Sometimes that means therapy, but the challenge is finding a couples therapist who's competent and trustworthy. So today I want to give you a few quick pointers on what to look for. I'll discuss 3 common complaints I hear from men about couples therapy, why those complaints are sometimes correct, and how to shoot for better outcomes. I'll also cover 3 red flags to avoid in therapists. Before we get to any of that, there's a caveat. If either half of a couple is abusive, addicted, actively cheating, or there are serious mental health problems, then couples therapy will be a waste of time, and most therapists will refer you to someplace more suitable. But the right therapist can be a real asset for 2 healthy people who want to work through their problems, especially if they catch those problems early while they still like each other. I should also add that I'll be talking about what I think makes for good therapy, but I didn't write the book, so shop around and choose wisely. All right, enough foreplay. Let's get to complaint number 1. By the time you go to therapy, it's already too late. This complaint seems to come from men who tried couples therapy and their problems got worse. It also comes from men who've never met a therapist in their life, but they read that therapy failed some poor guy on Reddit. There's an implicit assumption in this complaint that the therapist's job is to save the relationship, but that's not the case. Here's one of the things you need to know going into couples therapy. Even though you and your wife or girlfriend are both clients, the therapist's first allegiance is to the relationship. That's kind of an odd concept that exists for legal and ethical reasons, but it does not mean the therapist is responsible for preserving your relationship or even advocating that you should preserve it. The therapist's job is to build insight that the 2 of you haven't been able to develop on your own. What you do with that information, that's entirely up to you. That doesn't mean therapy should leave you feeling despondent like someone who just watched Leaving Las Vegas. A good therapist usually brings optimism, not through silly platitudes or cheap techniques, but by helping couples change the tone of their conversation and step outside of their old automatic reactions. Even if they can only maintain it in the presence of the therapist at first, that's a little ray of sunshine. However, not everyone who goes to therapy is looking for a ray of sunshine. Sometimes someone has already decided the relationship is over. They just haven't said it out loud. They have some other reason for going to therapy, like finally expressing years of pent-up resentment or working up the courage to say they're done. And sometimes therapy shines a light on problems that can't be repaired. Bottom line is that sometimes this complaint is correct. Sometimes the patient is dead on arrival. But over the years, I've noticed something interesting about this particular complaint. While men frequently say that by the time you go to therapy, it's already too late, women frequently complain that men won't go to therapy or even have a meaningful conversation in the kitchen until they're threatened with divorce. I think that's an interesting contrast. It suggests to me that at least some of us men have ourselves to blame for letting little problems turn into big problems. Complaint number 2. Couples therapists just sit there and validate the woman's grievances, then the 2 of them gang up on the man. At the heart of this complaint is the belief that psychology is an overly feminized field and that couples therapy is all about building a better beta. Well, it embarrasses me to admit it, but it's often true. Too many therapists follow my profession's leadership and view masculinity with suspicion. They assume that we men, with all our toxic masculinity, are responsible for causing relationship problems. Therefore, we men are responsible for fixing them with endless talking and concessions. One man told me online that when his wife was terrorizing him with temper tantrums, a therapist gave him tools to diffuse her anger. In other words, the therapist made him responsible for containing her emotions. It's not the husband's job to fill in for his wife's prefrontal cortex or vice versa. I don't even know how to do that, and the idea is insulting to both of them. I don't know if it's a true story, but I've seen similar situations frequently enough to give the man the benefit of the doubt. I'm also aware of plenty of examples in which a husband persuaded a therapist to triangulate against his wife in a similar fashion. So why does this happen? Why do some therapists choose sides? Well, in any therapeutic relationship, each half of a couple tries to pull the therapist into their way of viewing the relationship and their way of behaving toward their partner. For example, an overbearing and controlling wife may try to enlist the therapist into helping her control her husband, or someone who has learned to get their needs met by being timid and frail might try to turn the therapist into their enforcer by cultivating sympathy. It's good that people do that in therapy. It gives the therapist first-hand insight into what the clients are experiencing with each other, but a skilled therapist doesn't get sucked into the pattern. This particular pattern of ganging up on the man happens frequently enough for me to say it's a legitimate complaint. If it happens more often to men, that may come down to the fact that most therapists are women, and some of them have an axe to grind. Male therapists with an agenda may be even more aggressive about rescuing alleged damsels in distress. If it happens to you, that is, if you experience browbeating at home, and if therapy replicates that browbeating, then it's up to you to point it out. A lousy therapist won't like that one bit, but a good therapist will be happy you spoke up. Complaint number 3. Couples therapy is all talk and no change. Therapists just listen. They don't give enough advice. In most domains, like law or plumbing, it's smart to pay for advice from someone who knows the terrain. But in therapy, advice giving is the mark of somebody who doesn't understand the nature of the job, which is to help you unravel what's going on behind the scenes so you can live on your own terms. Skilled therapists are in the freedom business. That's what sets us apart. Here's what I mean by advice giving. One of the most common pieces of hack therapist advice is to tell a couple to go on a date night. Some therapists seem to think their clients will reignite the flame if they gaze into each other's eyes over a basket of popcorn shrimp. In reality, the only thing that will get inflamed are their old arguments. When an apprehensive couple is sitting there over appetizers with the entire evening looming over them, they're like two animals in a cage. They'll either retreat to their respective corners or they will tear into each other. This is just one example of the way in which advice backfires, and that's one of the reasons people like me avoid it. But that doesn't mean the therapist just sits there like an expensive lump. Couples therapists need to be pretty active. Their job is to find words for patterns and motivations that have been operating behind the scenes. If all goes well, then the result is new and better options. Here's an example. Suppose a husband develops a habit of retreating from his wife when he senses conflict. He's not trying to hurt her. He's trying to reduce conflict by minimizing the opportunity for friction. But when he retreats, it makes his wife anxious. She feels like she's losing him, so she pursues him and tries to get him to re-engage. She's not trying to hurt him. She's trying to reduce conflict by reducing distance. To him, her pursuit feels like conflict, so he retreats even further, which compels her to pursue him even more intensely. Both parties are inadvertently fueling conflict. You and I, as outsiders, can see the downward spiral, but the couple can't. They're too entrenched. It's second nature. On top of that, they're each blinded by the feeling that they're under attack. Once they see what's happening, then new options become apparent. Most people don't need to have the answers spelled out for them, and if they do, then we get to explore why they trust an outsider more than they trust themselves. That process of untangling motivations cannot happen when the therapist is telling you to hit the local Applebee's for a night on the town. A skilled therapist has ways of saying, "Did you notice?" rather than "you should." You want advice? Ask a stranger at the grocery store. It's free and it's equally ineffective. But if you want to improve the nature of the relationship, then find a consultant who knows how to open new avenues you didn't know existed. In my professional opinion, that's what clients should expect from therapists, not flimsy advice. So there's our 3 complaints. Believe me, it's an incomplete list, but there are only so many hours in a day. Before we get to our red flags, let me remind you, gentlemen, that I have 2 books to help men avoid couples therapy altogether by bringing the right women into our lives. Now, it's not for me to say how awesome my own books are, so go check out the reviews. But not that one. And by the way, Gatekeeper is new. It's got some catching up to do because unfortunately, it's my best kept secret. If you like my work, maybe you can help me fix that. Leave a review, give a copy to a friend, buy one for a therapist. I'll leave links down below. All right, red flag number 1. The therapist doesn't understand your goals. One of the first things a therapist should inquire about is your intentions for therapy. Sometimes a couple doesn't know what their goal is, and that's a fine place to start too. The point is, the therapist should attend to your needs from the beginning. Watch out for therapists who diagnose your problem right out of the gate. The ones who tell you your love language is out of whack, or your attachment style is all wrong, or whatever's the flavor of the month. If it feels like they're shoehorning your situation into their worldview, you might keep shopping. Sometimes it takes a few sessions to even describe the problem accurately. That can be frustrating when you want relief, but in my experience, it's time well spent. Personally, I believe in defining the problem before you get after it with your biggest hammer. Slowing down is a good way to speed things up in the long run, if you know what I mean. I'm not the only one who thinks that way. If you watch a seasoned therapist at work, you'll notice them slowing down when everyone else wants to speed up. They do that because they want to understand what's happening in those little moments that try to sneak by unnoticed, and couples have a lot of those sneaky little moments. By the way, this is a good time to point out that I've been using the word therapist, but that word doesn't mean much because it's an unregulated term, at least here in the US. Any no-talent numbskull can call himself a therapist. You can guard against that to some degree by looking for someone who has at least a relevant master's degree and a license. It's no guarantee of quality, but at least you know they can follow directions and they have some skin in the game. Plus, a license usually comes with some kind of accountability to colleagues. That helps us stay ethical. And really, this red flag boils down to ethics. If a therapist takes you on as a client, but they can't or won't help you pursue your goals, then you're not getting what you paid for. Red flag number 2, the therapist cannot manage the room. Couples therapists need to be calm and assertive in order to prevent arguments from spinning out of control. Good therapists don't sit there confused or pissing themselves when tensions run high. They have compassionate ways of keeping things focused, and if necessary, they enforce agreed upon boundaries. They start building that framework from the very first meeting. I've never worked with a couple who wasn't thankful for my willingness to intervene when they were headed toward an argument they've had 1,000 times before. If a therapist can't help you contain your conflict, provided you are both willing to contain it, then it doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad therapist, but they might be the wrong therapist for you. Red flag number 3. The therapist acts like Judge Judy. There's a common misconception that a therapist's job is to be a moral authority and decide who's right and who's wrong in any given situation. Unfortunately, that's a misconception held by a lot of therapists. Some even believe it's their job to scold the one they believe is the troublemaker. This is a very bad sign. It's one of the worst. It usually means that the therapist has been pulled into the couple's destructive patterns. They're just another broken cog in a malfunctioning system. Let me give you an example. Suppose during a therapy session, a wife reports to the therapist that she caught her husband giving a flirtatious glance to another woman. The wife becomes tearful, and the therapist, moved by the woman's distress, clubs the man over the head with shame by asking, "Can you see how hurtful that was?" That kind of response is a king-size professional blunder. It's worse than the time judges scored a tie between Holyfield and Lewis.
That's a travesty. That is, ladies and gentlemen, a travesty.
There are too many problems here to discuss in a short video, so I'll stick with the broad strokes. Aside from the ethical misstep of pitting one client against another, the therapist doesn't know if the glance actually took place or what it meant, and there's usually no way to sort it out because couples have unbelievably bad memories about their disagreements. And the facts don't really matter that much anyway. Therapy is not a court of law where we tally up grievances and rectify the past. The work of therapy is to untangle what's happening here and now so you have new options in the future. In this example, here and now, the woman is putting the man on the defensive, and it's worth understanding why. Maybe she's trying to say something important to both her husband and the therapist. Maybe it's just emotional manipulation, or maybe it's her way of talking about an ongoing sense of betrayal. Who knows? It's the therapist's job to help them puzzle it out so they don't get hung up on similar events in the future. The moment a therapist turns into Judge Judy is the moment they can't possibly help you make sense of your relationship, and they're probably adding to the problems you came in with. If a therapist takes sides against either one of you, then it's up to you to bring it to their attention. Again, a lousy therapist won't like that, but a good therapist will thank you. All right, gentlemen and ladies, there's a lot more to say on this topic, but this video is already too long. So if you have questions for future videos, leave a comment or flag me down over at X, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.